Today we're diving into a really tough but absolutely critical topic, the normalization of racism. Now, our source material for this explainer looks at this through a pretty unique lens, not just as a change in what people think, but as a kind of societal illness, a sickness that, once it gets a foothold, can actually impact everyone. Let's get into it.
This quote from Sal Nassim, it really hits home, doesn't it? It just perfectly captures this feeling that, the rules for how we talk in public have shifted and fast. And that erosion of accountability, that's what our sources point to as the very first symptom, the moment the whole societal immune system starts to fail.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to unpack this idea of the racism virus. Then we'll look at exactly how this kind of bias spreads. After that, we'll examine what it means to have a sickness in society, explore the collapse of accountability that lets it all happen, and finally, we'll get to what the sources are calling the ultimate political endgame of this whole trend.
All right, first up, the racism virus. This is a really powerful metaphor from the work of Dr. Shungu H. She's basically urging us to see racism not just as some hateful ideology, but as something that can actually be transmitted and caught, an illness we all have to confront together.
Okay, so this brings us to this idea of asymptomatic individuals. Think about it like this. The sources describe them as people who spread biased or racist views, but they're not necessarily being overtly hateful. And here's the crucial part. In an environment where discrimination is becoming normalized, anyone's thinking can be affected. That means these so-called carriers can actually come from any racial group. So the big question is, how does a virus like this actually spread? Our next section is going to break down the mechanics of how these ideas can travel from the absolute fringe right into the mainstream conversation. Our sources lay out a pretty clear four-step process. It all starts with that erosion of accountability we mentioned at the top. This kicks off what's described as a race to the bottom in public conversations. From there, the baseline for what's considered acceptable discrimination gets raised, and that ultimately shifts the entire window of what can be said and even proposed in public. And this idea of shifting the window is a key tactic. The sources point to the example of mass deportations, an idea that not long ago would have been totally dismissed as a political impossibility, is slowly, deliberately, and bit by bit introduced into the conversation, moving it from something unthinkable to something that's actually up for debate. Now, this shift is often helped along by coded language. It's like a Trojan horse for more extreme ideas. The sources argue that phrases that seem kind of harmless on the surface can actually be masking what they call simpler and more sinister desires, making them sound way more acceptable for public discussion. So what are the actual effects of all this normalization? Section 3 gets into this, looking at it through the lens of a sickness in society, where the pain of one group ultimately ends up hurting everyone. This quote really gets to the core of Dr. Magadz's argument. Normalized racism isn't some contained problem that only affects its direct targets. It actually diminishes the entire country, making society as a whole less healthy, less complete.
And this leads to what the sources describe as a kind of dual vulnerability. So on one hand, the virus makes the entire societal body sick, everyone suffers. But on the other hand, just like with a real illness, some parts of the body are way more vulnerable than others. Specific groups get targeted more directly, usually because of visible differences and existing power structures.
And the sources are really specific about who is at the highest risk. They identify minority groups, kids and young people, the elderly, people with learning disabilities, and ethnic minorities as being particularly vulnerable to the worst impacts of racism, often because of a mix of their visibility and institutional power dynamics.
Let's move on to our fourth section, which really digs into what happens when a society's immune system gets weak. And in this metaphor, that immune system is all about accountability. The sources really zero in on the lack of accountability as the absolute starting point. It's the precondition for everything else that follows. The moment consequences for hateful speech just disappear, the door swings wide open for the baseline of acceptable behavior to drop, and drop dramatically.
And the consequences are just huge. A lack of accountability doesn't just mean more offensive comments, it fundamentally changes a society. It raises the bar for what even counts as discrimination. It affects how everybody thinks and acts. It emboldens perpetrators who know they can get away with it, and ultimately, as we've seen, it diminishes the entire nation. And that brings us to our final and, frankly, most disturbing section. If the normalization of racism is a process, well, where exactly is it leading? The sources point to a political project they call the remigration endgame. So what on earth is remigration? Well, the sources define it as the mass deportation or forced removal of non-white and migrant communities. It's presented as an idea that's being deliberately pushed from the extreme fringe towards the center to make it seem like a respectable topic for political debate. The authors are crystal clear about what they see as the ultimate objective here. Remigration isn't just about immigration policy. They identify its core goal as achieving homogeneous whiteness, what they call a project of racial purification.
So this, of course, leads to a pretty chilling question. Practically speaking, what would it actually take to implement something so extreme? The sources argue it would require nothing less than a complete and total overhaul of the state itself.
And this slide just shows how radical that project would have to be. To achieve it, the sources say you'd have to dismantle human rights laws, weaponize government agencies, redefine citizenship based on race, criminalize entire communities, and probably operate in a permanent state of emergency. I mean, these aren't small changes. They're fundamental transformations of a democratic society.
And this isn't just some dystopian theory. The sources ground this in the real world by pointing to political movements in Europe, like the AfD in Germany and Vox in Spain, where elements of this remigration idea have been openly supported. It just goes to show how these ideas are gaining traction.
So, to kind of bring this all together, the key takeaway from the sources is that none of this is an accident. The path from losing accountability for what's said in public, to shifting the window of what's acceptable, all the way to proposing extreme political projects like remigration, well, it's presented as a very deliberate and calculated process.
We're going to end on this incredibly powerful thought from James Baldwin, which was cited in the source material. He wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." If normalized racism really is a societal illness, as our sources are arguing, then the first, most necessary step toward any kind of cure is finding the courage to face it.